As I stepped into this story of the Transfiguration from Luke's Gospel this week, two things have been on my mind. The first, like many of us, I imagine, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It has been completely devastating to watch it unfolding this past week, and to watch so many heart-wrenching, heartbreaking images come across my screen. Images of Putin cruelly and coldly announcing his decision to invade. Images of families with young children taking shelter in basements, subway stations, and bomb shelters. Images of Russian tanks callously running over civilian cars. Of thousands of people leaving Ukraine only to become new refugees. Of lines of brave Ukrainian civilians volunteering to take up arms to defend their country, and brave Russians protesting the war and being arrested. Of President Zelensky pleading with other countries to please stand with him and offer tangible support, and refusing to leave himself. Like you, I imagine, I have been filled with many different emotions about this past week, including feeling utterly helpless to do anything besides praying. The second thing that has been on my mind this week is the untimely death of Dr. Paul Farmer this past Monday. Farmer, as you might know, was a global health champion, a Harvard Medical School professor, anthropologist, author, and co-founder of the nonprofit Partners in Health, which completely changed global approaches for responding to diseases like tuberculosis, HIV, as well as Ebola. As a medical student, Farmer founded a clinic in Haiti that would end up growing into a vast network serving some of the world's poorest communities, grounded in the simple idea that high-quality medical care should be available to everyone, including the poorest people in the world. Many countries and politicians, and indeed many of Farmer's own colleagues, argued that it simply wasn't practical to offer this level of care, the kind of care that he envisioned for poor people. Farmer disagreed, and he made it his life's work to show that in fact it was possible, and moreover that it was morally unacceptable to settle for anything else. Farmer often had a critical view of international aid, preferring instead to work with local providers, clinicians, and leaders. He and his family often lived alongside the people that he was treating, including in Haiti and Rwanda, where he died on Monday. Motivated by his Christian faith and grounded in liberation theology and God's preferential option for the poor, one of the things that Farmer often talked about was something he came to call pragmatic solidarity. Pragmatic solidarity. Compassion, or suffering with, that's important, he said, but it's not enough to make things better for poor people. Compassion has to go further. It has to have concrete actions that are aimed at actually alleviating suffering and actually improving life for other people. Pragmatic solidarity. Solidarity, pragmatic solidarity, actually brings me back to our gospel story for this morning. For although it might not be apparent on the surface, I think today's gospel story about the Transfiguration is also, at its heart, a story about solidarity. In it, of course, as we just heard, Jesus takes Peter and James and John up on that mountain to pray. There, Jesus is transfigured before them. His face changes, his clothes become dazzling white, and Moses and Elijah appear on either side of him, speaking with him about what is going to happen to him in Jerusalem, where, of course, he will offer his life. All of this must have been quite a light show. And of course, Peter's response Two, it is, as we've come to expect from Peter, seemingly idiosyncratic. He wants to build 3 shelters, one for Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. It's as if Peter, fearful and worried about what is going to happen to Jesus, not to mention to his followers, wants to contain the vision of glory that he and his disciples have seen, to protect it, to keep it safe, which I guess, if we can put ourselves in Peter's shoes for a moment, is understandable. But just then, a cloud overshadows all of them, and overshadows Peter's fear, and there is that voice that says, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." After that, the disciples find Jesus alone again. Luke says they keep silence and tell no one what they have seen. Now that's where the story of the Transfiguration typically ends, right? On the mountain. The part of the story that comes right after that, when Jesus and his disciples go down the mountain, is actually an optional part of the gospel story in the lectionary for today. And usually we just leave it out. But the truth is, what happens after the mountaintop experience is also part of the Transfiguration story. In fact, I would say what happens to Jesus and his disciples on the mountain really has no meaning unless it's connected to what happens right afterward, down below. And that, of course, is that the moment that Jesus and his disciples come down from the mountain, they are immediately confronted by people's needs. No sooner have they caught their breath than the crowds find them, and a man begs Jesus to heal his son, which the disciples had apparently not been able to do. Jesus is exasperated. "How much longer am I going to have to put up with you people?" he says. But then he takes the little boy and casts out the unclean spirit and heals him and gives him back to his father. Although this part of the story didn't happen on the mountaintop, it too is part of the Transfiguration story, I think. Because the truth is, the point of Jesus' transfiguration isn't just so that he and the disciples can have their own private moment of basking in the glory of God, their own special light show, their own personal religious experience unsullied by the hoi polloi, their own mountaintop experience that is neatly compartmentalized from the rest of their lives and disassociated from reality. I don't think that is the point of the Transfiguration. The point, I think, is actually completely the opposite. The point is to change them. The point is to open their eyes and their hearts further to the world, including to the world's suffering. The point is to send them back down the mountain, back into the world, to live in greater compassion and solidarity with the world. The point is not to be removed from it, but to be more involved in it. Jesus' life of prayer, those times when he steps away for even a few moments to connect more deeply with the one he called his Abba, his Father, they always, always, always led him to deeper engagement with the world, including with the world's suffering. His time away was never about escaping the world or escaping suffering. It was always about facing it more fully and more faithfully. It was about solidarity. And that's what the Transfiguration was about too. for him and for the disciples. It wasn't just about having a private religious experience up in the clouds. It was about the world, and it was about solidarity with the world, and especially with those who suffer most. Some of you may have heard of Heidi Newmark, a Lutheran pastor who ministered for 2 decades in a church in a tough area of the Bronx in New York City, a church aptly named the Church of the Transfiguration. For a long time, the church's response to the challenges of the surrounding neighborhood had been to simply close up its doors and lock them tightly. But eventually, when Newmark coaxed them to open their doors a little more and to step out into the neighborhood a little more, things began to change. Yes, as Newmark later reflected, they were confronted by a community convulsed and mauled by poverty. But they also discovered transfiguration as they began to build new relationships with their neighbors. Newmark wrote that the congregation came to understand that living high up in the rarefied air isn't the point of transfiguration. It was never meant as a private experience of spirituality removed from the public square. It was a vision to carry us down, a glimpse of unimagined possibility at ground level. To be transfigured, to be truly transfigured, is not to stay up on the mountaintop, basking in the light. It's not just to come to church every week or have our own private religious experience with God, one that is neatly compartmentalized from the rest of our lives. The transfiguration is all about the rest of our lives. The whole point of being transfigured is to come down the mountain, to see the world and its chaos and its suffering through new eyes and new hearts, to be willing to enter into this world more fully and faithfully and fearlessly, just as Jesus himself did. To be agents of transfiguration and people of solidarity. And if what we experience on the mountaintop doesn't help us to do that, if it doesn't lead us to live our lives with greater solidarity with the world, including with the world's suffering, then what we do here in this place, it isn't really transfiguration at all. It's just a light show. I also think that this invitation, that this reminder, is also what the coming season of Lent is all about. This season that we will begin together this coming Wednesday on Ash Wednesday. Lent is a wonderful gift that the church gives us every year to do some spiritual housework and some taking stock. If I'm honest about myself, there is a temptation with a season like Lent for it to become otherworldly, for it to become one extended mountaintop experience, for it to become about retreating away from the world and focusing on myself and my own spiritual practices and what I need to do to make sure things are right between God and me. And of course, there is nothing wrong with focusing a little bit on our own spiritual lives and practices, or with carving out time for God during Lent, or any time. We need to do that. Jesus needed to do that. But at the same time, I think we always need to ask ourselves, is what we are doing during this season, is it ultimately sending us back down the mountain? Is it ultimately sending us out into the world, out of our buildings, out of our hearts, out to be agents of transfiguration, out to be people of solidarity, out to be Jesus' very body, broken and given for the world. Amen.